Dirk, you are in an institution who's hopefully going to change this. So we're looking forward to your presentation on the energy community and its potentials.
Thanks a lot. And I must say, Dennis, it really takes a lot of courage to come here to this beautiful and clean Energie Salon and present pictures like that. You feel a bit dirty and a bit from the part of Europe. That's what they call in German a Schmuddelkind. At the same time, I'm also very grateful to Robert, who said at the beginning that we are not here and we cannot afford in Germany, and I happen to be German, to finger point to the region, because we have a shared past and to some extent a shared present also in between Germany and Southeast Europe in relying heavily on coal. We are not in a position here as Germans to point to these dirty practices there in Southeast Europe, and yet we all have a shared and common goal and desire to change that. I am maybe a bit more optimistic than the gloomy title of today's session suggests. I do believe, and that's another lesson and another good reason to be here in Germany, that this energy transition that has started, or at least has been promoted very much here from Berlin, has become a global trend, as is manifested in the Paris Agreement, and it is something. It started as a small river, but it turned into a mainstream to which also the region will not be able to resist. What we have to do altogether is probably how to kickstart and then how to manage that transition, and that's what I also would like to focus a little bit on. The energy community has been mentioned, that the yellow-blue countries are the energy community countries. I have a lot of text on my slides. That's probably also because, as a representative from the energy community, I have to take a bit of a regulatory bird's eye perspective. Starting with the importance of coal, I believe I can be very brief, because that is indeed this part of our shared history, like Germany, also Yugoslavia, just relied, and that explains, of course, on all the problems that we have to deal with today, relied on what it had, on its natural resources. Unfortunately, not blessed by nature, neither like Albania, the other country there in the Western Balkans 6, which is 100% CO2 free in its electricity mix. That was not the case in Yugoslavia, and also the lignite and the brown coal there is not of the best quality. So we have to deal with this legacy, just like we have to deal with a similar legacy here in Germany. The way how to deal and how the European Union or Europe in general decided to deal with this legacy, which we know, of course, was made much worse than in the 1990s by all the events and the decay and the negligence that was given to all these inherited structures. The response was the energy community. Back in 2005, when Europe decided that they would indeed not only take care of this region, which is and will be again a core European region, but will bridge the gaps, the existing gaps between our countries here in Western and Central Europe and Southeast Europe through a treaty, the Energy Community Treaty, which, with hindsight, maybe unfortunately, but those were the days back in the 2000s, focused very much on market reorganization, on liberalization, on integration of markets. That was the fashion in the EU at the time, and almost the single objective also of European energy policy, and that's, of course, it was just consequential that the same was done also with respect to the Southeast European countries in order to give them a European perspective, in order to enable them to reintegrate what was destroyed. Now, as outdated as that may seem against the pictures that we just saw, no market liberalization will, of course, help in closing a plant like Tuzla. It still matters, and it is still very beneficial. I will talk about this a little bit later. Already then, in the early 2000s, when the treaty was drafted and ultimately adopted, nobody actually took this serious. There were small islands, maybe ticking time bombs of environmental acquis hidden. So acquis is European legislation hidden in that treaty, like the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, like the Large Combustion Plants Directive, all these horrible names from Brussels, which also had a certain lead time, so they only kicked in later, namely today. So in 1st January 2018, the Large Combustion Plants Directive finally entered into force, but they proved to be really game changers. This entry into force of the Large Combustion Plants Directive, which doesn't exist even in the EU anymore, in the countries of Southeast Europe, is a Copernican moment, and I believe will really kickstart this energy transition. It's a legal obligation, as such, maybe not too impressive, but it's also a clear sign that from now on, each and every plant, with certain exemptions, will be checked on their compliance. And each and every plant which is there in the region, because they're old, because it's almost impossible to retrofit them, will not comply with those. So in essence, we should already from 1st January 2018 have closed all these plants. Now the Large Combustion Plants Directive and the more modern Industrial Emissions Directive has some inbuilt exemptions as well. This is the so-called NERPs, have already been referred to. The National Emission Reduction Plans, which is a possibility not to be judged and assessed on a plant-by-plant basis per country, but that you put all of them together in a cloud and then you move gradually towards an overall reduction limit. And also this so-called opt-out, like a wild card, you can say this and that plant had to be authorized by the energy community institutions. We will run for 20,000 operational hours more. That looks like being very generous, and I guess against the backdrop of the pictures that we still have in our minds, indeed, you would ask, why don't you just shut them all down, and why is the legislation indeed so generous? But first of all, this is of course something that we have benefited here in Germany as well from. This is European legislation, and secondly, it only means that if you talk about exemption, that you will really have to focus on the entire rest, and this is what we have to do now, and Tuzla is of course among them. So if the end of coal-fired power generation in the Balkans hasn't really started or hasn't really come on 1st January 2018, we experience here the beginning of the end, and thus probably also the beginning of the transition. That, I believe, is a fact, and that is something that will happen with or without, and with or against the Chinese or anybody else who will invest in coal-fired power generation in the region. The question, of course, and I think this is the really important question that we all have to ask ourselves, and we have to contribute finding answer, is what do we offer? You cannot just point to legislation and say we switch off Tuzla, we switch off all the other coal-fired power plants in the region, and that's it, because obviously then the lights go out and much more. So what can we offer in replacement? And that is something that I would like to discuss also with you. What can come after coal, after all? New coal, more coal. We heard that first of all, it's difficult to bring the existing. It's almost impossible, also financially impossible, because no lender will be ready to give money to that, to bring the existing plants in line with the thresholds under this Large Combustion Plants Directive and IED. So for them, it's with some delay, but it's game over. We in the energy community very much insist, and we had cases there where we also cooperated with Pippa and Dennis, where we made this very clear that any new plant must fulfill the standards of the Industrial Emissions Directive, so that's European standards. That's clear. If there is coal, then it must be the same emission criteria that also would apply here in Germany. This compliance with the law, however, goes beyond. And there the law is, it has been said, I am a lawyer, and there I have to, especially here in Berlin, I'm reminded of my legal education and also the books I read, among others of a certain Niklas Luhmann, who very clearly said that the legal system is about being either illegal or legal, and there is nothing between. And this is something that helps also in tackling issues and the problems related to coal-fired power plants. It's not ideology, it's the law. And what kind of instruments does the law provide? Well, the Large Combustion Plants Directive obviously is one. We have this Environmental Impact Assessment Directive. I have an interesting case currently going on against a power or related to a power plant in Republika Srpska of Bosnia, Ugljevik, which concerns compliance with the environmental impact assessment, where, for example, they did not assess the greenhouse gas emissions coming from that plant. Now, they thought they were right in doing not so, because the emissions trading scheme and greenhouse gas related legislation is not part of the energy community yet. However, through the vehicle, through the back door of this environmental impact assessment, you could, and that's what we're doing, reproach the authorities that they didn't take all the consequences into account when they assessed or when they gave the permit for that plant. But maybe the sharpest sword is something that is called the state aid law. That's probably a subject not often discussed here in these circles and in relation with the energy transition, etc. But it turns out that it's very powerful because it means that as a state, you may not support or only under very limited conditions and circumstances, you may support the creation, the building of the construction of new coal-fired power plants, including, for example, through guarantees that the state gives for free to a lender, Chinese, German, or wherever they are from, including through land for free. Pippa mentioned a few cases. So again, it's the law. It's not so much whether you complain about subsidies to coal in general, but it's the question, and that's a very technical question, which we in the energy community perform on a daily basis. Is this particular measure a state aid, a prohibited state aid within the, or in the meaning of the European legislation? So that's how concrete but also maybe boring energy transition can be, to look into the very nitty-gritty details and then to, of course, take the consequences of this. The ETS, I mentioned that currently we have no emissions trading scheme. The emission trading scheme is an instrument in the EU which was not one of the sharpest swords that we had. Now it's been a bit more, made a bit more fit and sharp, probably, sharpened. We may get it, we will ultimately get it with EU accession. Maybe we'll get it before in the region as well. But it's still on the horizon. Once it is there, it's probably also possible to give coal a real price. But that, for the time being, requires a lot of not only conviction of national politicians, but also conceptual thinking, whether that's possible after all, especially for energy sectors only. So one alternative for coal is more coal. Another alternative is gas. Now, gas is also not CO2 free. We know that. It's been labeled in recent years a bit as the bridging fuel, which goes together very well with renewables. But of course, if you were to counsel the governments in the region, get out of coal, get into gas, you would also ask them to do heavy investments in infrastructure which eventually still will be a CO2 infrastructure. That may be something which would be desirable in the short term, but infrastructure happens to be costly and happens to lay around for a couple of decades. So are we really ready to advise them to go into gas now with all the consequences on a broad scale? I think this requires a deeper assessment. Of course, also including the geopolitical factors that, especially in the region, that comes with more dependence. Renewables is the obvious answer. We have talked about hydro already a bit. Hydro is the other alternative fuels traditionally also in Western Balkans 6, but recently has very much come under attack because if you saw all the ugly pictures from Tuzla, you could see beautiful pictures from Albania and the unspoiled, and also Bosnia and Herzegovina, the pristine rivers there, and are we ready to really intervene there and build hydro power stations and dams wherever we can? Big question mark behind that. Wind and solar, indeed, a very big untapped potential, probably more in solar. Unfortunately, there's no potential for offshore wind in the region like there is in Germany. Onshore, yes, but mostly solar. But the problem of wind and solar is, of course, one that we all know very well here in Germany as well. It's intermittency. You cannot rely on that. You cannot just switch from coal to 100% renewables. That would be naive. And you would not take into account legitimate concerns about continuation of life there, of economic life also in the region. I will talk in a minute also about a bit more concrete obstacles that wind and solar exploitation, which needs to happen, which need to increase, but which never can fully replace the baseload that coal has been producing so far, but the obstacles that we are facing there. Biomass, maybe, could be an option. Maybe large-scale biomass, replace, and currently there's projects on their way. There's people who say you can replace all the coal by biomass. Of course, that would have other big and heavy consequences. You would have to go into forestry. It can't be an option that we just cut all the beautiful oak woods in Bosnia and Herzegovina to replace coal by something else, by something which is considered renewables. But at least it would have the advantage, done in the right manner, that it would provide security of supply, baseload that is needed. And all these issues I would put at your, for discussion maybe later, in one recent project, which is the so-called Kosovo ERE power plant, a very controversial one in the place of the same name, Kosovo, where they indeed will build a new power plant. The contracts have been signed based on lignite, where we as energy community have raised very strong concerns as regards to state aid compliance, less to environmental compliance, but the state aid issue is a pertinent one there. But where we also have to ask ourselves the questions, what are their alternatives? And I think this is something that we can maybe brainstorm later. What do you do in a place like Kosovo, where there is little else? There is the potential for renewables is not so high. Gas, there is none, so you would have to build new infrastructure. Biomass, there is also none. So this is, I believe, a good case study, and I'm happy to go into that later to where we can maybe jointly explore not only what we don't want, but what we actually would want, or what we would realistically also be able to counsel to the governments there. Renewables, as I said, is the future. There is no doubt about that, and there will have to be, and there will be, significantly more renewables in the region. And that's the core of this energy transition. Being here in Berlin, we can ask ourselves the question, because energy transition worked here relatively well in Germany away from nuclear, to some extent from coal and gas, towards renewables. Can we just copy that? Well, maybe we could, but who would be able to pay the price for that? This region is not populated by wealthy Germans, not by us. This region is populated by people who cannot afford the price that we are paying here in Germany, the costs for the renewables. And on top of this, there is a vicious circle going on which has to do with the costs of capital, because the countries are considered so risky. You cannot lend money, you cannot borrow money at a decent price. So you're obliged to give high feed-in tariffs, which make the price of electricity higher for a population which almost cannot afford the existing one. That's something we have to tackle. This problem with the so-called de-risking, with the bringing down of the capital cost, is something that urgently needs to be tackled. Probably one of the things that would have the greatest impact. Your colleagues Agora here, I don't know where they are, somewhere in the neighborhood, developed quite a couple of good ideas on this. Another thing, another relatively low-hanging fruit that immediately needs to be reaped is move away from these old German-type feed-in tariffs, Einspeisetarife, to auctions. This is something that we see here in Germany, offshore wind, but also solar. How much you can bring prices down through auctioning, not through giving away support, again subsidies, state aid, by the state in an intransparent manner, in a way too expensive manner, and not only for renewables but also for coal. This Kosovo Re power plant I mentioned guarantees a price of 80 euros per megawatt hour, which is something you will not find anywhere in Europe anymore. We have to move away from that. We'll have to upgrade the infrastructure in the region, and not the big lines. There is no lack of big interconnectors in the Western Balkan 6, as some people seem to believe. We have to look into the small distribution network to make it fit for the challenges of renewables. That's where the region is really not fit for taking in more renewable energy. We have to integrate the market. Yes, the original idea of the energy community still lives and is still as important as it ever was. One of the answers to the question posed by Kosovo Re is, of course, more market integration. You do not have to build power plants in every country as if they were isolated, as if they were islands. If you actually do integrate your markets across border, then you can make huge welfare gains and you can trade with your neighbors. That's important. And something that some of the European thinking that is only slowly hitting the region needs to be implemented much more faster. Capacity markets is something that we developed in places like France and UK, where this balance between intermittent renewables and some stable baseload capacity is at least tried to be achieved. We still don't have that in the region. We still suffer from this wish of being an exporter at all costs, like Bosnia and Herzegovina, from this wish of having autarky, understandable after the disasters of the 90s, but not something for the future, and on this belief in an old-fashioned system with central and big plants that take care of entire big regions or even countries. And about the social aspects, I will not even talk about. We have to find answers for the employment as well, but also for the poverty in the region. That is pretty clear. Just by way of conclusion, what I believe will be very important is governance in the future. That's a boring word, but it is the stream that will carry away and carry with it also the nations and decision makers and the actors in Southeast Europe. First of all, we have to, of course, now I'm talking as a lawyer again, stick to the rules. We are, as energy community and incorporating with Dennis and Pippa, for example, we can always only be in the second line of defense. The problem is the first line. The national authorities and institutions are too weak. not by bad intent, but just institutionally. They cannot handle these issues. So they need to be strengthened, and that not only or that does not only go for enforcement of the rules like the Large Combustion Plants Directive, that also goes for measurement, we heard about that, for monitoring, for reporting. All of this needs to happen in the region, and they need ours and your support for that. We need, and I'm very happy that we have this really well-functioning dialogue with NGOs, we need not only institutions that defend the public interest in clean air and in health, etc. We need private attorneys of the public interest, civil societies attorneys of the public interest, and they start to be active and to be more active also in the region. That's something very good. We need further integration with the EU, not in the idealistic sense, but in the concrete sense. There is a project now on coal regions in transition in the European Union that immediately needs to be expanded to southeastern Europe. There is the so-called clean energy package in the European Union that immediately needs to be exported also to Southeast Europe because it sets the right signal. There is, for example, some kind of an exchange, a Börse in the making, where countries can trade their surplus renewables target achievements. Recently, Luxembourg bought quota from Estonia and Lithuania. Why not from Montenegro? They have a huge surplus. They could also sell. They need this support. They need to engage in the market as well. We also need to be more serious with planning. These strategies and partly also the so-called NDCs under Paris Agreement in the region are very often not worth the paper that they are written on. We need to follow the European mainstream again, go into serious nationally integrated energy and climate planning. We need also targets. That's something that we're working on in the energy community for 2030 on renewables, on energy efficiency, but also a cap on greenhouse gas emissions as we have them in the EU. To conclude, we should not, as we have done in the past, follow this old logic that we are developing something here in places like Berlin and elsewhere, and then we graciously, with a delay of 10 years or so, export it to the countries in Southeast Europe as if they were some developing countries. We are here acting and working under the threat and challenge of climate change, and that is a global one that concerns us all together. That is the global unifier as well, and for this we really need to do things together, and I think that's where I see with all these gloomy pictures and all these sad stories that we certainly have there in Southeast Europe, also of a big chance of moving forward together. Thanks a lot.